Have you ever wondered why it is that folks coming out of relationships with an individual involved in intimate terrorism can struggle for months, if not years, after finding their way into safety? Well, that's the topic of today's video learning series here at Being Trauma Informed. My name's Chris Wilson, the director of Being Trauma Informed, and let's look at why it is intimate terrorism has such long-term devastating consequences. So let's talk about this long-term impact that intimate terrorism has on the brains of those who find their way to safety, even years after the fact. Why it is that, for example, a client of mine, years after getting out of a relationship with an intimate terrorist, found herself frozen in the grocery store because she believed she saw another customer flexing their hand. Or a young woman who I did an evaluation with who said, I know this doesn't make any sense, but every time she saw a car that reminded her brain of her ex-abusive spouse's car, she had to make sure that it wasn't her husband's car. And she said, it doesn't make any sense. Like, I knew cognitively it wasn't his car, but I had to make sure he wasn't the person driving the car. And I think you'll find that this is the experience of a lot of survivors. Logically, it doesn't make sense. Logically, you look around and say to yourself, there's no threat here. I'm safe. I'm in a new relationship. I'm in a restaurant where my abuser is nowhere to be found, and it's been 10 years, and my abuser doesn't even know where I am. Why is it that people continue to feel anxious, continue to feel a sense of impending doom? Well, there's three factors that come into play, and really, instead of come into play, I think it's fair to say they conspire to make recovery extremely challenging. The first factor is the notion of our system that we use for first mapping environments to either safety or threat. And that simply means that the brain has determined that there's something in the environment that's consistent with threat. So we map it to threat to be more aware. That system, which also then is about awareness and eventually detecting threat, becomes extremely sensitized. So we're walking around with a system that has become extremely sensitized to anything in the environment that the brain associates with the intimate terrorism. That then brings up the second factor, which is this notion of organizing, if you remember from last week. Remember, organizing are all the subtle and not so subtle ways our partners and our friends and our family members let us know what they want. So now you've got this sensitized system, and you're in a new relationship, or you're with your friends at dinner, or you're at your parents' house, and somebody in the environment either uses a tone of voice or a facial expression or a posture that your brain associates with your former abusive partner. And that, because your system is highly sensitized, leads to this feeling of anxiety, leads to this feeling of, oh my gosh, something horrible is, even though logically you look around and say, this is ridiculous. I can't believe I'm feeling this way. But it doesn't change the fact that you are feeling that way, because this is not about logic. The third factor has to do with the fact that trauma challenges the brain's ability to do what we call differentiate or tell the difference. And in particular, it's tell the difference between the past when the trauma occurred and the present when we're experiencing this triggered experience of anxiety and dread. The brain struggles to tell the difference. That, oh, this is 2019. It's not 2010 when I was being abused. So these three factors conspire to make it incredibly challenging, even in a new healthy relationship. We're at dinner and I ask my partner how their day was, and my partner had a horrible day. And so looks up with a feeling of annoyance, not because my partner's annoyed with me, but because my partner had an incredibly challenging day. And my brain suddenly says, that's consistent with threat. and I feel anxious and I don't know why. Cognitively, I tell myself this doesn't make any sense. There's something wrong with me. When the reality is my brain is just doing what brains do. Now, I think it's fair to say that this experience of being easily triggered, of the brain over-interpreting stimulus in the environment or even internally. In other words, you can trigger yourself simply by thinking about the past. Safe to say that's an experience that's not limited to folks who experience intimate terrorism. That's for folks who experience child abuse. That's for folks who experience being sexually assaulted or folks who've lived through combat, for example. I think the challenge for those who've experienced intimate terrorism is that the organizing that occurs in intimate terrorism occurs in all facets of our lives. And so it becomes essentially a trigger fest for the brain. Going to the grocery store, going to work, meeting with friends. There are unfortunately, so many opportunities for the brain to misinterpret the environment based on the sensitivity of the system, the fact that those cues are all over the place because everybody organizes, and because the brain is challenged when it comes to differentiating, telling the difference between the stimulus here in 2019 and what it experienced back in 2010 or 2000 or 1990. So I hope that helps you understand the unique nature of intimate terrorism when it comes to recovery, when it comes to feeling whole again, feeling healthy again. Now, for those of you who are survivors or work with survivors, let me encourage you to assist them in making referrals to therapists who use techniques such as EMDR, eye movement desensitization and reprocessing, or other therapies that have to do with what we call sensory integration, so mindfulness-based yoga, or the technique that David Berceli used, the trauma release exercises. I would encourage you to refer folks to therapists or clinicians who have experience with these modalities. So if you have questions, comments, please feel free to leave them on the YouTube channel or send us an email, info@beingti.com. My name is Chris Wilson, the director of Being Trauma Informed, and I want to thank you for tuning in today. Next week, we're going to do a video called You'd Stay Too, which examines the intersection between the logistical challenges and the brain science to help us build a sense of empathy for the challenges that survivors and victims of intimate terrorism face when attempting to find their ways to safety. So take care, have a good week, and we'll see you next week here at Being Trauma Informed. Bye-bye.